Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman. Welcome to my tutorial, Picnic Flowers. This is our reference photo for this painting. I found it on pixabay.com, a great resource for artists. Most photographs on Pixabay are both copyright-free and attribution-free. This particular photo was taken by a photographer named Gunter Schneider. She has a lovely collection of photographs on Pixabay, and I highly recommend that you check them out if you like this style. The supplies I use for this project include Arches cold press watercolor paper, 140 pounds. If you want to do your drawing in pencil first, use a 2H or lighter, and use a kneaded eraser to lift out any pencil lines. For my drawing, I did it directly in ink. I wanted a more spontaneous style, and I used continuous line contour drawing. Basically, once I put the pen down, I didn't lift it very often as I worked my way around the biggest shapes in the drawing. For my watercolor brushes, I use black gold 311s, which are round brushes, size 00 and size 0. Of course, you'll need water and a water container and paper towels. All my watercolor paints are Daniel Smith. In this painting, I use sap green, green gold, phthalo turquoise, phthalo blue green shade, which is quite different than phthalo blue red shade, quinacridone purple, quinacridone rose, opera pink, alizarin crimson, Aussie red gold, new gamboge, and Hansa yellow light. You don't have to use these colors. In fact, I encourage you to use whichever colors appeal to you. Here is my line drawing. As you can see, I've drawn in the tablecloth, the vase, and the flowers. I have not drawn in a horizon line or the edge of the table on the front side of the painting. I will paint in a horizon line, but I didn't want to draw too much attention to it by also inking it in. As I mentioned earlier, most of this drawing is done as a continuous line contour drawing. I put my pen down and I continue to draw most of the shapes without picking it up. Once in a while, I will pick it up and put it back down to start a new shape. I kept the drawing fairly loose, not drawing in every detail. If you chose to draw yours in pencil first and then ink on top of that, be sure to erase your pencil lines before you start painting. And finally, we're ready to paint. I start off with my bigger brush and using just water, paint in the background. I'm painting in a sky on the upper half of the painting and arbitrarily choosing where that horizon line will be. I'm painting in with water first because I want to do the sky wet into wet. It gives you nice, soft, diffused edges on the blue and white paper, creating a softness in the sky, reminiscent of soft clouds on a summer day. To load my brush with water, I don't just dip the tip of my brush into the water. I dunk all the bristles in there, making sure that my brush gets fully loaded. I want to paint the watery shapes as quickly as possible and with enough water that they don't start to dry before I have a chance to drop paint into them. I don't want the area where I began painting my water to be completely dry by the time I get to the end of this shape. So I'm moving fairly quickly, even around the edges of the flower. The ideal time to drop paint in isn't when there's puddles of water pooling up on the paper surface, but once that water has had a chance to soak into the paper and is just leaving a bit of a shine. If your paper doesn't have a shine to it, it's just too dry to create that wet into wet effect that I want in the sky. I stop painting the water where I want the horizon to meet the grass. Since I'm painting the blue sky wet into wet, this arbitrary line that I've drawn in with my water shows me where the sky will end and the grass will begin. My paper is just slightly shiny and it's the perfect time to drop in the paint. I pick up phthalo blue, green shade, fairly watery because phthalo blue is a very strong color. And I start to paint in some strokes for the sky. Notice that I'm going to leave a lot of areas as just the white of the paper. Since the paper is wet, the blue will continue to travel softly even into the areas where I have not painted any color. But by leaving a lot of white, I'm creating the sense of clouds and a real lightness in the sky. I'm getting progressively darker as I move down towards the horizon line. And to make that darker, I'm just picking up more paint at a slightly thicker consistency. To paint these billowy clouds, be sure you don't use just horizontal or vertical brush strokes. Notice how my brush is going in several different directions. I also have all the blue and white shapes appearing to come out of the center of the flowers, out towards the edges of the paper. On the left-hand side, I see a little bit of a dark line forming where my paper is slightly damaged. If your paper is slightly scuffed up, it's easy for paint to accumulate in there and create a darker line. To avoid that, I just use my towel to soak out some of the paint, and you can see how that damaged line almost disappears because the paint is so light in that area now. I use the same phthalo blue green shade sky color to paint in a few of the shapes in between the flowers and leaves to make it look as if we can see some bits of sky between some of the flowers. I make these areas fairly dark to draw contrast between the sky and the flowers. Again, I paint into that area and remember, oh, there's a little bit of damage there, so I better lift that out. And you can see how the damage line just disappears. Try not to overwork this area. Just drop in that paint onto the wet surface and you'll get these lovely soft edges. We get into more trouble when we keep brushing and brushing and brushing even as the paint and paper are drying. While I wait for the sky to dry, I add just a touch of quinacridone purple to my phthalo blue and I paint in a soft shadow. My tablecloth will be white, but I don't want to just leave the entire tablecloth the white of the paper. And by adding this soft shadow, it creates a nice feeling of movement in the tablecloth. Keep this color really light. I don't want this to look like purple stripes on a white tablecloth, but rather just the slight suggestion of a shadow. I soften the edges by cleaning out my brush, tapping out the excess water on my towel, and then just running my brush along those paint strokes that I just put down on paper. That will give your shadows a nice soft edge. I also added some of that purple color inside the vase to reflect the darker water areas. And while it's still damp, I add very light watery sap green and green gold. I let the purple and the green mix together. I'm still keeping these colors very light. Now that the biggest shapes are painted in, I rinse out that brush and I pick up my smaller brush. the 31100, and I'll start working on some of the smaller shapes of color. I begin with a watery mix of quinacridone rose and start painting those tulip shapes that are embroidered into the white tablecloth. In the photo, I can see that the tablecloth's embroidered tulips have lighter and dark parts of them. I'm not being extremely literal, but I do like that there is a change in value on these colors. So at first, I'm just painting the lightest rosy color that I see on all these tulips. I'll come in later and either soften up or darken certain areas to get more variety. I go back and soften up some of the shadow I painted earlier. I'm going to give that area a chance to dry. So I turn my attention to the yellow flowers, and I start with a watery mix of new gamboge. Pretty loosely, I paint the entire shape of that first flower. And I find that also these flowers are more successful if you're willing to leave little specks of white paper here and there. Specks of white paper give the appearance of being sunlit. Here I'm still using new gamboge, slightly more watered down than earlier. I reach for some Aussie red gold and paint in the center while that yellow is still wet. I use the same color to paint some darker areas on that first yellow flower as well. Again, try to just drop your color in and not overwork the area. Give the watercolors a chance to blend into each other on their own. Here I use a mix of new gamboge, Aussie red gold, and I just touched a bit of that quinacridone rose into it. And I start painting one of the other yellow flowers that are farther back, slightly darker and slightly more pink. The right-hand side of this particular flower has quite a bit of pink in it for the shadow side. And while it's still damp, I add some of the quinacridone rose to that corner. Try to just get in with your paint, drop it in, and get out. I turn my attention back to the embroidered tulips on the tablecloth. I soften up some of the areas of the color I put down earlier. And now I pick up thicker quinacridone rose and add in some of the darker accents we can see. Right away, you can see how much life this breathes into these details. Having different values, even of the same color, always adds excitement to the shapes we're painting. I let these darker brushstrokes of quinacridone rose settle into the paper a little bit while I rinse out my brush. I tap out the excess water on my towel, and then I go in and soften that dark paint into the lighter areas. I'm just barely touching the edge with the damp tip of my brush. It creates a nice soft shift from the dark to the light side of whichever shape and subject you're painting. Then I pick up some green gold and decide to paint in some of the brighter yellowy leaves and stems. I will come in and add sap green to create darker accents on these areas, just like I created darker accents on the embroidered tulips. Here I'm picking up the sap green and mixing it right into that green gold. With just the tip of my brush, I paint in some stems, darken some areas on just the green gold leaves, and then also just paint some leaves entirely with this sap color. Be sure you paint your greens with some variety. You don't want all the leaves and stems to be painted with the same value and color. Even if you just have one green in your palette, you can add yellow to brighten it or add blue to darken it. But give your greens some variety. I use the same mix to paint in some of the green embroidered leaves and stems on the tablecloth. Try not to paint these in all in the same way. For some of these, I add sap green. In other areas, I just allow the green gold to sit by itself. And also in the tablecloth, we see a few little peekaboo holes that show us the table underneath it. Since my tablecloth in my painting is sitting on green grass, I will also paint those holes with the same green. Ultimately, I'm not too concerned about differentiating between the leaves that are embroidered on the tablecloth and the holes that are showing the grass underneath it. In this looser style, I'm not worried about having to paint strictly within my ink line drawing. Sometimes even painting slightly off from the ink line drawing can be quite charming. I work my way around the entire border of the tablecloth, adding green gold and sap green to create a variety in all the details. Before taking on any more details in the tablecloth, I'll let that dry. So I'm going to turn my attention back to the flowers. Again, with New Gamboge, I begin painting that large sunflower at the top of the bouquet. My initial wash is fairly watery, making this first layer of color a really light yellow. For the center, I pick up just a touch of green gold. It's also very watery, but that center of the sunflower needs to be distinguished from the rest of the flower. And in the photograph, I do see some green in the center. Some sunflowers have a more orangey center, so if you prefer to do that, you could certainly add orange to your center. I water down quinacridone purple for a couple of the other flowers. These four-petaled flowers are all purple with a darker center, and I leave little specks of white paper here and there on them. At this point, the sky behind it is completely dry, and I'm not worried about the colors blending into the sky. I use the same watery purple to paint in the three flowers that have fallen from the bouquet onto the tablecloth. Again, this is very watery, and I'm also mixing in some quinacridone rose just for variety and leaving specks of white paper. I pick up thicker quinacridone rose to start painting in some of the other flowers. Painting in dark in some areas and giving that paint just a chance to settle into the paper before I come along and soften that edge. It gives the appearance of the flower having a darker area on the petals and lighter towards the tips of the petal. For the next flower, I actually mix in a little bit of opera pink into that quinacridone rose. Opera pink is a very neon color, and by itself doesn't seem very natural. But added to quinacridone rose, it creates beautiful pinks for flowers. I painted the left side of this flower with a watery mix of opera pink and quinacridone rose. And for the right side, to help add volume, I add a lot more thicker quinacridone rose into the mix. It gives the appearance of the flower turning away from the light. I also leave some specks of white paper on the edges. For this central flower, there's quite a bit more of a red hue in it, and I add alizarin crimson to my quinacridone rose. I use the tip of my brush to paint the edges of those petals instead of trying to draw with my brush and then color it in. I work my way around the outside petals first, and since the center of this flower is quite darker, I add thick alizarin crimson to my mix and paint in the center. I decide to use the same mix to paint this flower, even though in the photograph it's much more pink. I really love that pop of red. I add just a touch of quinacridone rose to that red that I painted earlier with alizarin crimson to lighten up the edges, again creating a darker center and lighter petal edges. While it's still slightly damp, I drop in some thick alizarin crimson right into the center and decide to do that on one of the other flowers as well to create even a darker center. It gives it a nice three-dimensional look, and the variety of colors is always exciting. Tucked behind the red flower is an even darker red flower. So for that, I pick up almost exclusively alizarin crimson in my brush at a fairly thick consistency. This will give me a really nice dark for that back flower. I love doing these bouquets of flowers where they come together almost like puzzle pieces, painting one shape at a time until you filled out the whole arrangement. It's exciting to see it come together. In the photograph, I see a pink flower behind this really dark red flower. But instead of trying to squeeze in one more shape, I decide to just make this dark red flower a little bit bigger and take up that entire area. I lighten up the petals slightly by just painting with a damp brush and pulling over the paint that's already on the paper. I rinse out my brush and I pick up really watered down quinacridone rose for the pink flower that I see in this corner. Notice every time I clean out my brush, I tap out the excess water on my towel. That gives me a lot of control over how much water I'm putting into my paint. I see that the center of my sunflower has really faded, so I do another real light layer of green gold mixed with sap green just in the center. And with more green gold on my brush and sap green, I start painting in the remaining leaves and stems. In some areas, I'm just going to leave green gold, but in other areas, I want to put in accents of sap green. Leaves get overlooked a lot in floral paintings, but they can make or break a painting. Be sure you give the leaves and stems just as much attention and care as you do the rest of the painting. Some of the shapes that I'm painting green, I didn't even really draw in as a leaf or a stem, but I want to create the sense of thickness and foliage in between these flowers. So for some of these green shapes, I'm just making them up as I go. I also darken a few of the stems that show up in the vase and add a little bit more green into the bottom of the vase where the color would be bouncing around the glass and the water reflections. I want to add some detail to the three small purple flowers that seem to have landed on the tablecloth from our bouquet. With quinacridone purple, I give them some dark centers. Only on two of the flowers. The third flower is actually facing away from us and we see the stem coming towards us. So for that, I pick up some light green and paint in that stem. It's time to paint in those green shapes that would be the grass showing up through the embroidered holes in the tablecloth. For this, I create a nice puddle to paint from with thick sap green and a touch of phthalo turquoise. These shapes are not much different than the embroidered leaves on the tablecloth, but I'm painting them darker and they are smaller. You can see that as I start to paint them in, it gives all the embroidery work on the tablecloth more form, more shape. As I start to finish up these details, It's now time to turn my attention to painting in the grass. I'll use the same puddle of sap green with phthalo turquoise, and I've just added a touch of green gold to it. You can see from my palette that I have a pretty big puddle to work from, but I know that that won't be enough to cover this whole area. I don't feel like I need to create a puddle big enough for any shape. Especially something like grass would not appear to be the same shade of green every square inch. There would be variety in the greens. So if I have to mix in different colors to keep that puddle big enough for me to keep painting from, I'm just fine with that color shifting slightly as I mix different colors into it. And you can see that as I paint my green grass, I'm not using broad horizontal or vertical strokes. I paint in a few directions and then change direction. I put my brush down and tend to just wiggle it around the paper. I want this grass to look pretty organic and not as if I was painting the side of a house with perfect vertical brush strokes or horizontal brush strokes. A little bit of texture in this area will work just fine for the effect. I paint carefully around the border of the tablecloth, but then I paint pretty quickly. To avoid any odd hard edges, I want to paint rather quickly to make this a fluid green shape. I like that there's a difference in greens. In some areas it's darker, in some areas it's lighter. It's definitely more exciting to look at than if you just painted this all from the same puddle of, let's say, sap green, which would give it a very flat and somewhat boring look. As that puddle of green paint in my palette is starting to run out, I just added some sap green to it. This will be a slightly different shade of green than the rest of the grass, but it's close enough. Give yourself some variety in these greens. Here I even added a touch of quinacridone purple to that green, just to make it look like it's slightly farther set back into the distance than the green that is up closer to us at the bottom of our painting. Remember that things that are farther in the distance tend to have more of a bluish cast to them. And here I'm just adding a few touches of sap green at a thicker consistency to create more of that texture. Again, I just add more paint into my mix and keep going. Painting always more carefully around the edges of the flowers and the edges of the tablecloth. Lightening up that paint on that edge of the paper where there is a scratch. By lightening it up and lifting out some of the paint, that scratch mark happily disappears. It can be tempting to overwork the grass, just like overworking the sky. I would recommend undercooking these areas rather than overcooking. In other words, let it be and decide later if you really need to do more work to it. Don't try to make that decision in the moment because most likely you will keep painting it until it's overworked. The subject of our painting really is this lovely bouquet on that lovely tablecloth. So I would say put your detail and your time there. The viewer's eye will definitely go to those areas where you put the most time and effort, and you don't necessarily want that to be the grass or the sky. I turn my attention back to that center sunflower, and with a lot of Aussie red gold and a touch of new gamboge on my brush, I start painting in that darkest center part of the flower. Then I add new gamboge to my mix, and I start painting out from the center to the lighter edges. And then with just barely a damp brush, I use it to drag the color I've already painted up into the lighter portions of the petals. Right now there's no fresh paint on my brush, it's just water and the paint that is already on the painting. I add a touch of yellow to that center, and then I mix in the alizarin crimson that I had on my palette from earlier. And I start adding darker accents where I see the flowers might need it. This was too dark, so I just rinse out my brush, tap out the excess water, and soften that dark red. And this flower also could use a darker center. I'm looking for areas on the yellow flowers that could benefit from darkening up with a bit of orangey color. For my orange, I've really just mixed alizarin crimson into my new gamboge. I touch quinacridone purple into that alizarin crimson and paint in the dark centers of my purple flowers. With very watery phthalo blue, I add another bit of color to the glass vase and the shadow right underneath it. As I'm getting towards the end of this painting, I'm really just looking around for any last minute details I can add. This is usually when I add my darkest little spots of color. Some artists will call them eye magnets just because a dark spot here and there can really add a lot of dimension and excitement. I decide to take my yellow, which is the new gamboge, with a touch of Aussie red in it, and paint in a yellow border on most of the tablecloth's edge. This isn't in the photograph, but I feel like the tablecloth already imitates a lot of what's going on in the bouquet. It's just missing a touch of yellow. And it ties these two elements together quite nicely. I don't paint that yellow every square inch around the border of the tablecloth. I really hop around here and there. And I add really watery yellow also into the water. The water in a glass vase will pick up on the reflections of colors that are bouncing around in the scene. I water down a bit more of quinacridone purple, and now that those centers are dry, I come in and add just a touch of darker purple right in the center of those petals. With a damp brush, I soften from the dark purple area into the lighter tips of the petals. And that has given them much more dimension already. All that's left is some detailing on that center sunflower. I pick up a fairly thick mixture of new gamboge, Aussie red gold, and alizarin crimson. I dry out the moisture that's in my brush on my towel so that I'm painting almost dry brush. And I come in and add some final dark dots around the center. I then soften that area into the larger area of the flower. With just New Gamboge on my brush, I do another round to give these petals more dimensionality. I have some lighter petals poking through that are just the Hansa yellow light I put down initially. And then the middle tone is New Gamboge, and the dark tone is New Gamboge mixed with Aussie red gold and alizarin crimson. And with that, I'm really ready to finish this painting. The last few touches I want to put in are on the little blossoms that have fallen onto the tablecloth. Just a touch of quinacridone rose. Just a few touches here and there, and this painting is complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for joining me for painting picnic flowers. See you next time.